Chapter 1. A Light in the Distance Act. The farthest edge of a quiet land where the earth dissolves into sea and the sky stretches wide and unbroken. There stood a lighthouse. It was tall and round, its white stones faded with salt and sun, with a red-capped lantern at its crown that swept its gaze across the ocean. Its light pulsed gently at nitre slow, patient heartbeat guiding invisible paths across dark waters. The lighthouse was not young. Its base had been laid nearly a century ago by hands long gone. Yet its purpose endured, steady and unchanged. It had stood through gales and fog, through snow-laced winters and blazing summers, casting its beam into the unknown. And though most ships now followed satellites and silent systems, the lighthouse remained not out of necessity, but reverence. In the little stone cottage nestled at its base lived the keeper, a man named Elliot. He was neither old nor young, a man in the middle, the years of life, with weathered hands and a calm, thoughtful manner. He had arrived at the lighthouse 7 years prior, a quiet arrival, with only 2 bags and a typewriter. He'd never said much about the life he left behind, late that it had been noisy. Here, life was different. The mornings began not with alarms, but with light sunlight spilling across the sea, glinting on the waves and waking the gull. Elliot would wake early, even before the sky turned orange, and set the kettle on the old iron stove. The house smelled of cedar and salt. Windows framed every view of the sea, and the floor creaked warmly beneath his feet. Outside, dunes rolled, in soft waves of grass and scattered shells, while the wind carried the scent of tide and rain. The routine was sacred. After tea, Elliot would climb the spiral staircase within the tower, 1 step at a time, feeling the cool stone beneath his hand. At the top, he would inspect the great glass lens, polish the brass fixtures, and check the mechanisms. He did this not out of obligation, but out of quiet pride. The lighthouse was alive in its way, and he was its caretaker. Mid-mornings were often spent outside. He would walk the beach with a slow, meditative pace, picking up pieces of sea glass or driftwood shaped by years of travel. He kept a journal in his coat pocket and often paused to scribble a few words or sketch a tide pool. He called these entries observations of peace. His handwriting was small and careful, like someone folding a thought into a bottle to cast dew into the sea. Sometimes he would sit on a moss-covered log at the edge of the dunes and simply listen. The sea had a language of its own waves, like whispered lullabies. Seagulls crying in the distance, wind murmuring through the tall grasses. Once he timed the intervals between waves and found a pattern like breath. He wrote it down and titled the entry, "The Ocean Breathes." Afternoons brought slow hours. Elliot would cook simple meals with ingredients from the nearby village vegetables, grains, sometimes fish brought by locals who visited once a week with supplies. The villagers knew of the lighthouse, of course, but few had seen its keeper up close. He was something of a legend among them, a quiet man who chose solitude over speed, who lived in rhythm with light and tide. Sometimes he would walk the cobbled path inland, a winding route through a whispering grove of pine and birch. There was a bench halfway, carved with initials from decades past, where he'd sit and eat an apple or read a few pages of a worn poetry book. These walks were as much a part of his routine as lighting the lamp or brewing his tea. Evenings were his favorite. The sun would dip low, gilding the sea with liquid fire. He would light the lamp at the top of the tower, watch it begin its slow turn, then settle by the window with a book or his typewriter. He wrote small stories, gentle tales, with no villains, no chasers, no endings. Just people walking through soft landscapes, touching things gently, listening to the world. He wrote them for no one but himself. And the nights, they were pure magic. The wind would soften, the sea would hush, and the stars would bloom overhead. Eliot often sat outside on a wooden bench, wrapped in a thick blanket, a mug of warm mint tea in his hands. The sky above the sea stretched out forever, black and brilliant, the Milky Way spilling like a ribbon of dust. Sometimes he would speak, aloud, not to anyone, just softly into the air. It's a good night, isn't it? And the sea always seemed to answer. One evening, a storm approached from the south. Thick clouds gathered on the horizon, rumbling softly as they crept closer. Eliot watched their arrival with calm anticipation. He prepared the tower secured, the windows, tested the backup oil lamp, reinforced the shutters. By nightfall, the wind had risen, whistling low and strange, and the rain began in soft taps against the glass. He sat in the tower, then, the lamp turning slowly above him, casting its light through sheets of rain. Lightning flashed in the distance, turning the world silver and black. The sea roared, yet the lighthouse held steady, its stones unmoved by wind or wave. Eliot watched it all, not with fear, but with reverence. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a beach scrubbed clean and a sky washed clear. Eliot walked the shore in silence, his boots leaving soft impressions in the wet sand. He found unusual things that day, a carved piece of wood, polished by water, and a stone that looked like an egg. He placed them gently in his coat pocket and returned home, the lighthouse behind him gleaming in the new light dot. In the weeks that followed, Eliot noticed subtle changes. The wind smelled different, softer, somehow more fragrant. Seals began peering again on the far rocks, their round eyes watching with curiosity. A pair of oyster-catchers nested in the dunes, and Eliot, careful not to disturb them, gave them names in his journal, alder and fern. Each evening now, as the sun began its descent, Eliot felt an unusual stillness and expectancy in the air. The beam of the lighthouse swept out across the water like an arm searching for something in the dark. And Eliot, too, began to wonder, was he waiting for something? That question sat with him as he wrote his stories. It lingered in the steam of his tea, in the curl of waves on the sand. He was content, yes, but beneath the contentment was a curiosity, like the scent of rain on dry earth, something stirring. Then, on the first day of spring, As the breeze turned warm and the sky bloomed with cirrus clouds, a boat appeared. It was small, bobbing gently as it approached the shore. Elliot saw it from the tower, a tiny speck moving across the vast blue. He watched it for nearly an hour before it reached the cove below the lighthouse. A single figure stepped onto the beach. They carried a satchel and walked with care, stopping to examine stones and seaweed as though the beach were a gallery. Elliot waited, unsure whether to go down or stay hidden. In the end, he did neither. He remained at the window, heart quiet but alert, watching as the stranger made their way toward the lighthouse. They didn't knock. Instead, they sat on a large stone just beyond the fence and opened a notebook. The wind tugged gently at their coat. A bird circled overhead. The sea was uncharacteristically calm, and the only sound was the faint scratching of a pen across paper. Elliot stood watching them for what felt like hours. His tea had long since cooled IT. Wasn't until the sun had begun to set that they looked up, directly at Elliot's window, and smiled. He raised a hand in greeting. The stranger nodded and returned to their writing. Elliot stepped away from the window and stood in the quiet of the house, the beams of the setting sun filtering through the walls. Something in him felt different, as if a page had just turned. Quietly, in the story of his life, the lighthouse remained silent, steady, but in the air, something new shimmered possibility. The morning after the stranger's arrival dawned soft and golden. The sea whispered against the sand like a secret being told again and again, and the sky held a lavender haze that made everything look like it had been painted in pastels. Elliot stood by his window, sipping his tea, watching the cove where the stranger had arrived. The stone where they'd sat the night before was now empty, and the boat was tethered with careful knots to a rusted ring embedded in the rocks. He wondered if it was right to go and say something. After all, this was not a place where people simply arrived. But before Elliot could make a decision, there was a soft knock at his door to polite taps. Then silence. When he opened the door, the stranger stood there. They were tall, wrapped in a sand-colored coat with a knit cap pulled low and a green satchel slung across their shoulder. Their face was serene, with eyes the color of kelp and a quiet, curious expression. "Good morning," they said, with a voice that carried the rhythm of waves. "I hope I didn't intrude yesterday." Elliot shook his head. "Not at all. I'm passing through," they continued, following the coastline. "I heard there was an old lighthouse still kept by hand. I didn't expect to find someone here, or maybe I did." Elliot offered a seat by the garden bench, and they sat together in the early sun. A kettle soon whistled from inside, and he poured them both a cup of tea. Their name, he learned, was Moran. Moran was a writer. They told Elliot they were traveling the coast to write a book of essays pieces on quiet places, on lives lived close to the rhythm of the natural world. The lighthouse had drawn them like a beacon. "I think I was writing about this place before I ever saw it," they said, sketching something in their notebook. That day became the first of many. Marin stayed not in the house. but in a canvas tent pitched between two dunes near the cove. Eliot thought this curious at first, but then understood. They weren't here to intrude, but to observe, to listen. They were like the tide present, shifting and respectfully distant each morning. Eliot would see Marin walking the beach, collecting things just as he did Dod's stones. Feathers, bits of rope worn smooth by the sea. They wrote in their journal constantly, pausing now and then to stare out at the horizon as though waiting for the right word to arrive on a breeze. Their presence changed little in Eliot's routine, but it made everything feel subtly different, as though he had stepped into a version of his life where someone else finally understood its quiet cadence. Sometimes they would sit in companionable silence. Other times they would talk about birds, about the sea, about the kinds of stories that take shape only in places where the world moves slowly. They spent hours walking the coast together. Marin often asked questions that had no answers what the oldest girl remembered. How long the seaweed had drifted before it landed on shore. Why the wind always picked up at dusk. Eliot, who had grown used to quiet certainties, found himself dwelling in the wonder of unknowing. One evening, Marin brought Eliot a small glass bottle sealed with wax. Inside was a scroll of paper. "Open it later," they said. When the fog rolls in, that night the sea disappeared behind a curtain of mist. Eliot opened the bottle, unrolling the paper with care. Written in Marin's looping script was bare a single line. "You are a lighthouse, Eliot. You don't chase ships, you stand and shine." The words touched something deep in him. He placed the note on the mantel, beside a piece of driftwood shaped like a sleeping cat. They stayed through spring. Days passed like waves, calm and repetitive, each one slightly different. The dunes turned greener. The oyster-catchers raised chicks, and Eliot began leaving extra seed for the songbirds that had returned to the pines. As the sun grew warmer, Marin began to paint. They found an old easel in the lighthouse storage shed, brushed off the cobwebs, and set it up facing the sea. With watercolors and quiet concentration, they captured the shifting moods of the coast, the grey of foggy mornings, the lavender blue of dusk, the ochre tones of windswept dunes. Eliot would sometimes watch from afar, noting how Marin's brush moved like their handwriting fluid, thoughtful, deliberate. Sometimes they shared meals. Eliot would cook simple things, fish with lemon and herbs, bread with sea salt, honey, tea. Marin would bring jam made from coastal berries, or dried figs wrapped in cloth. These dinners were quiet, but filled with a sense of mutual comfort, like two pieces of driftwood resting against each other on a tide-worn shore. One morning, Marin asked, "Do you ever get lonely?" Eliot thought for a long time. "No, but I think I was waiting for what I don't know. Maybe for someone to ask that question." Marin smiled softly and returned to their notebook. Their journals became a kind of dialogue. Sometimes Eliot would find pages left for him about seabirds or half-finished stories about lighthouse keepers with magical dreams. He, in turn, began leaving folded notes on the bench, or slipped into the pages of a borrowed book. The stories they wrote were unlike anything Eliot had created before. They were filled with wind and water and light, but also with stillness and presence. He didn't write to finish them anymore. He wrote to feel something blooming inside him. One evening, as stars blinked into being overhead, Maran looked up from their page and said, "You know, I think this lighthouse might be alive." Eliot chuckled. "What makes you say that? It watches, it waits, it remembers, just like you." That night, Eliot wrote more than he had in months. The words came easily, like rain on dry soil. His typewriter clacked softly into the early hours, and when he finally slept, it was with a sense of having spoken something long held in silence. The days stretched and softened. They watched seals sun themselves on the rocks. A pod of dolphins passed by one misty morning, and they stood side by side, speechless. Maran began collecting sea glass, stringing the pieces onto lengths of twine that danced in the wind like coastal chimes. Eliot carved driftwood into smooth shapes and gave them names from dreams. One morning, Eliot found a folded page slipped beneath a stone on the bench. It was a page from Maran's journal. There's a stillness in him like the sea on windless daysiments, and unknowable. But I think he's full of stories, like driftwood waiting to be carved. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into the pages of his own notebook. He did not speak of it. He didn't need to. As summer approached, the air grew heavy with warmth and salt. Maran spoke of leaving, of moving further up the coast. Eliot listened, nodded. "You're always welcome back." "I know," they said. And then, without fanfare, without ceremony, Maran was gone. The boat left in the blue light of dawn, just as it had arrived, bobbing gently beyond the cove. Eliot stood by the tower window and watched it disappear. He felt no sorrow, only a gentle ache, like a tide receding. But something remained. A presence, like a shadow beneath water, a softness in the air. The bench still had a warmth to it. The journal pages still whispered dot. And so he returned to his days lighting the lamp, walking the beach, brewing tea, writing stories. But now, in those stories, there was another character, someone who asked questions, someone who listened. The lighthouse, too, seemed to sense the change. Its light moved with a kind of grace, as if it no longer searched alone. The birds sang differently. The sea sighed in new tones. Eliot no longer wondered if he was waiting. He knew now he was living, and somewhere out there, along the stretch, pause. He imagined another notebook, filling with words about lighthouses and silence, and the stories that bloom quietly, like stars, in the company of kindred spirits. The weeks following Maran's departure unfolded with a gentle rhythm. Eliot continued his walks along the tide line, continued tending to the lamp each evening. But now there was a soft ache in the air like the hush that follows a departing wave. It wasn't sadness, not truly. Rather, it was the awareness that something meaningful had touched his world and moved on. Leaving its imprint, he began to write again, not just notes or sketches, but full pages. Stories swelled with life and color. One was about a sailor who could speak to whales. Another told of a child who found a map inside a bottle and followed it to an island where shadows told bedtime stories. The stories had always been in him, Eliot thought. It simply took someone to awaken them. One afternoon, while reorganizing the small reading nook beside the hearth, Eliot discovered something strange. Hidden inside one of Merrin's borrowed books was a folded piece of watercolor paper. When he opened it, he found a delicate painting of the lighthouse scene from the beach in soft twilight tones. Beside it, written in Merrin's careful hand, some places hold their breath, waiting for the right soul to arrive. I think this place found Q. He stared at the page for a long while, the gentle press of memory like a wave against his chest. Then he framed it and placed it above the desk where he wrote. As summer slipped into early autumn, Eliot noticed the signs of change. The birds flew differently. The sun set earlier. And on certain days, the sea seemed to stretch just a little, further, as if trying to touch something just beyond reach. He spent more time in the tower, watching the horizon. He began to document the light when it caught on the waves, how it scattered through the mist, how it changed with the weather. He started sketching again, rough drawings at first, then more detailed studies of the coastline, the wind's patterns, spin the grass, even the curve of shells washed ashore. He restored a forgotten weather vane that had rusted in place. He cleaned the brass compass Merrin had once examined so curiously and mounted it on the study wall. Everything became part of a quiet continuum, as though the lighthouse itself were remembering Dot in the evenings. He took to walking the cliffs beyond the cove, paths he rarely explored before. One particular path twisted through tall grass and above a gentle rise, ending at a weather-beaten bench overlooking the open sea. He began visiting it regularly, bringing a thermos of tea and the little wooden carvings he made by hand seals, whales and shapes. No one had names for. It was on one such walk that he found a message. Tucked beneath a cairn of 3 smooth stones was a note, written in familiar ink and folded into a square. There are places I haven't reached yet, but you were the lighthouse I needed to pass this part of the journey. No signature, but he didn't need one. That evening, Eliot brought the note. Play inside and placed it gently beside the bottle message Merrin had given him long ago. The two looked at home together. The finding of the note reignited something in Eliot. He began crafting messages of his own, not to send, but to keep. Letters addressed to the sea, to the stars, to the idea of Merrin. He filled a small wooden chest with them, each folded with care, tied in twine, dated with the tides. He made a ritual of opening the chest once a week, rereading what he had written. Some brought laughter, others tears. But each letter reminded him that connection didn't always require presence. Sometimes it only needed intention. He started placing small gifts along the shored driftwood figures, jars filled with poems, polished stones, not for anyone in particular, just for the world, for the idea that someone might find them and feel, for a moment, less alone. Autumn deepened. The sea grew moodier, its shades darker, more profound. Storms rolled in from the horizon more often, and Eliot found comfort in the rituals of keeping watch. Lighting the lamp felt more important now, more purposeful, even if no ships passed close to shore. The idea of that light steadfast and constant meant something more. He resumed sending letters once a week. He would write something, a poem, pay a reflection, a short tale, and place it in a bottle. He would walk to the edge of the tide and release it to the waves. He didn't expect a reply. It was enough to send them, to let the words drift out into the wide world. Maybe they would reach Marin. Maybe they would reach someone else entirely. He started a new journal. Its pages were filled not with observations of birds or tides, but with thoughts. A lighthouse is not lonely, he wrote in one entry, because it belongs to the horizons, and the horizon always returns. In the lighthouse tower, where once there had been only dust and unused shelves, he created a small gallery. He displayed Marin's painting, some of his carvings, shells with spiral stories etched into them. Visitors rarely came, but Eliot liked the idea that if someone did arrive unexpectedly, as Marin once had, they'd find these small offerings waiting. He painted the front door, a soft teal, like sea glass. He repaired the creaking step. He oiled the hinges and polished the windows until they caught the sun like waves. He made tea every morning and placed 2 mugs on the table, out of habit more than hope. Sometimes he'd talk aloud, sharing stray thoughts with the empty room. The silence was no longer hollow. It had become a companion, a space where memory lingered. He began teaching himself to play the old piano in the corner of the living room. Slowly, with hesitant fingers, he pieced together melodies that felt like tides rising and falling, simple and true. He would play in the evenings, just before lighting the tower, letting the notes echo gently off the stone walls. One morning, as the air turned crisp with the early breath of winter, he found something in the garden, a small leather-bound notebook wrapped in string. Inside were pages and pages of Marin's script, stories, notes, sketches, some half-finished, some complete, all of them echoing the rhythms of this place, the lighthouse, the dunes, the sea dot. At the back was a message, for when you need a voice, not just silence. Eliot sat on the bench in the garden, notebook resting open on his lap. The gulls wheeled overhead. The wind carried the scent of salt and pine, and for a long time he did nothing but listen, not to the birds, not to the sea, but to something deeper, a story still unfolding. He wrote until the stars rose, and then lit the lamp in the tower, because sometimes shining is how one answers the dark. Winter arrived, not with a storm, but with silence. The first frost coated the garden in silver before dawn. It crept over the glass panes of the conservatory and curled into the corners of the window frames. Eliot woke to a hush so complete it felt sacred, as though the sea and sky had agreed to pause. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the cold had settled in like an old friend, wrapping its arms around the lighthouse. He stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of spiced tea, and watched his breath ghost across the air. The sea looked harder now, darker. The waves didn't frolic, they churned and climbed the shore like tired giants. The sky was a dense shade of pewter, without definition or break. Still, the light in the tower burned, steady as ever. Elliot had begun wearing his father's old fisherman sweater. The sleeves were too long, and the knit was coarse, but it held warmth like memory. He found comfort in the weight of it, the way it seemed to anchor him when the wind howled and the gulls screamed against the cliffs. Days blurred together in quiet rituals. The lighting of the lamp, the tending of the wood stove, the careful journaling of what he saw. A fox pawing through the snow-covered dune grass. The sudden arrival of migrating birds. The shifting moods of the ocean. Elliot built a habit of venturing outside each morning, despite the chill. Wrapped in layers, he'd trudged down to the shore and inspect the line where sea met land. One day, he found a cracked hourglass tangled in kelp. Another morning, a sealed tin box containing scraps of music handwritten on old ledger paper. He started documenting these findings, photographing them, sketching them, sometimes even placing them on the shelves in his small gallery room. He began calling them the shore's memories. On New Year's Eve, Elliot climbed the tower just before midnight. The horizon was swallowed in cloud, but the ocean still murmured, constant and close. He carried a lantern and a small bottle. Inside the bottle was a single note. May your light continue to shine, even when no one's watching. He set it adrift in the frigid waters, watching until the last gleam of glass vanished. Then he lit the lamp for the first midnight of the new year. January was fierce. Snow finally arrived, thick and unrelenting. The lighthouse became a world unto itself, swaddled in white, separated from even the road that wound back toward the town. Elliot didn't mind. Isolation had never frightened him. Wet was the absence of meaning he had once feared. But now everything felt deliberate. Every creak of floorboard, every echoing footstep up the tower's spiral staircase, every scratch of pen on paper, all held weight. He spent more time reading books Marin had left. Books he had once shelved, but never touched. He began writing his own story, a long one this time. Not a short reflection or fanciful tale, but a novel rooted in place. He called it The Watcher of the Wind. Elliot filled pages with quiet characters. A lonely weatherkeeper, a girl who spoke to shadows, a boy who discovered an ancient lighthouse where time behaved strangely. The story, at times, felt like a dream he was only half remembering. Some nights, he'd wake from sleep with a sentence already formed in his mind. He'd write it down without question. Once, it was, not all beacons guide ships, some guide souls. Another time, she never knocked, but the wind always changed when she was near. By mid-February, he'd filled 2 notebooks. One day, after a stretch of snowless sunlight, Elliot ventured beyond the ridge for the first time. in weeks. His boots crunched over frozen earth as he followed the trail through wind-burnt grass. The sea looked polished, its surface like hammered steel. He sat on his bench overlooking the water and, to his surprise, found something waiting. A jar. Inside it, a small pinnacone, a silver ring on a red thread, and a folded slip of parchment, written in the same hand as before. Not all departures are ends. Some are simply pauses. I hope you're still writing. I hope you're still shining. The note was signed, one letter only. M. Eliot smiled, the cold biting at his cheeks. The wind tugged at his scarf. The bench, though icy, felt warm in its familiarity. He added the jar to his growing collection inside the gallery. Each object had a story, even if he hadn't heard it yet. Maybe someone would come one day and recognize one of them. Maybe they wouldn't. Either way, the lighthouse was keeping them safe. March brought thaw, not all at once. The snow retreated slowly, reluctantly. Beneath it, green things began to stir. Crocus tips peeked through soil near the garden wall. A bird built its nest on the windowsill of the study. Eliot felt it to a thaw within himself. He had more energy. He rose earlier. He began baking again. Oat bread, lemon cake, biscuits that flaked apart in delicate layers. He wrapped them in cloth and left them on the bench near the cliffs, just in case someone came by on the equinox. He climbed the tower and watched the sky shift into pink and gold. It was the kind of sunset you didn't need to photograph, because it settled so firmly into memory you knew it wouldn't leave. He stayed there long after the last light faded, listening to the wind speak in long, low hums. He spoke aloud, quietly, as though to the sea. I'm still here, still shining. He wondered, sometimes, if Marin had found another shore, another lighthouse, another set of footprints to follow. He wondered if she still thought of this place, of him. But he didn't ache anymore. What they'd shared hadn't faded. It had rooted itself in the foundation of the lighthouse. One evening in April, Eliot received a visitor. It was unexpected, a soft knock at the door just after dusk. He opened it to find a young woman, wind-chapped and smiling, with a travel pack on her back. "Is this still the lighthouse on Quiet Shore?" she asked. He nodded. "I read about it," she said. "A writer lived here. He once carved stories into driftwood and set them adrift. I found one of them." She pulled a small piece of smooth cedar from her coat pocket. On it, carved in delicate lines, was the story of a boy who followed a bird through a storm and discovered a hidden island of stars. Eliot recognized it. He welcomed her in, made tea. They talked for hours about stories, about loneliness, about how small artifacts could carry entire worlds. She wasn't Marin. She wasn't meant to be. But she was someone drawn by the light, and that meant something by the time she left. The stars had bloomed across the sky. Eliot walked her down to the path and gave her one of the jars filled with poems. She hugged him once, gently, and disappeared down the trail. Back inside, Eliot stood before the fire, heart warm despite the cold outside. The lighthouse was no longer just a keeper of ships. It had become a keeper of stories, And Elliot, its quiet steward, had finally come to understand. The light was never meant to reach just one person. It was meant to ripple outward, finding those in need of it, those who were lost, those who were searching, those who simply needed to remember they were not alone. Spring rolled in on the backs of sea breezes and bird song. It didn't rush, but moved gently, softening the world with each passing morning. By the time the last frost had retreated, Elliot had filled 3 notebooks, planted the early seedlings, bin his garden, and restored the old wooden swing behind the lighthouse. He had started a ritual of walking to the cliffs just before sunrise. Wrapped in his thick sweater, he'd bring a thermos of tea and a leather-bound book of poems. Often he wouldn't read from it, just hold it and watch the sea shift from slate to silver, waiting for that quiet moment when the first light spilled over the horizon. That moment, to Elliot, was the most honest of the day. The young traveller, who had visited in April, her name was Junehad, returned once more. She stayed for 2 days, helping repaint the gallery room and rearrange the collection of Shaw's memories. In exchange, she left Elliot with a bundle of dried lavender, a story about a mountain path where the stars whispered, and a photograph, taken of the lighthouse from far below the ridge. "You never see yourself the way others do," she said, placing the photos in his hand. "But look at that light, Elliot. Look how far it reaches." That evening, Elliot hung the photograph in the stairwell of the tower, where the golden beam from the lantern sometimes touched it. The image caught something he hadn't noticed before. Flock of birds passing behind the lighthouse. The cliff bathed in a dusky glow. The edge of something timeless. A steady trickle of wanderers came after June. Never many, never loud. A musician with a bowed cello slung across her back. A teacher who collected rainwater and spoke in haikus. A boy who said nothing at all but left a hand-painted stone near the gate. Elliot never questioned why they came. He only ever asked if they'd like some tea. The lighthouse became less a destination and more a pause, a breath held in the middle of their journeys with each guest. The lighthouse bloomed anew. He began recording their stories. A new journal, this one bound in sea-green leather, sat near, behearth. In it, Elliot scribbled down overheard dreams, fragments of poetry, and the things people left behind. Feathers, trinkets, hand-drawn maps of imaginary places. The lighthouse had grown into a living archive. It was one evening in late May, while reshelving books in the tower library, that Elliot discovered something curious. Behind the wood panel in the Galleria panel he was sure had always been fixed, found a shallow compartment. Inside, a stack of yellowed papers tied with twine, and a faded photograph of 2 people standing at the edge of the cliff. One was unmistakably Marin, the other slightly taller. Smile Eskew was a younger Elliot. He stared at it for a long while, unsure if the tightness in his chest came from grief or a long-forgotten joy. The papers were drafts, letters he had never sent. Each began the same. Dear Ma. Each ended differently. I still hear your footsteps in the stairwell. I'm keeping the light burning, just in case. Do you remember the night we watched the aurora and promised to leave something behind worth finding. He read them all, one by one, and then sat in silence until the moonlight reached the floor the next morning. Eliot walked to the sea with a jar filled with petals and bits of starlight-shaped shell. He placed the letters inside, sealed the lid, and stood at the shore. "I hope the sea finds you," he whispered, "and if it does, I hope you know, ... I'm okay now." He watched the tide pull the jar from the sand, lift it, and carry it out, until it disappeared. In the days that followed, Eliot's dreams grew vivid. He dreamt of a second lighthouse on a distant coast, its light blinking in rhythm with his. He dreamt of Maran walking along a foggy ridge, pausing to watch a fox with seafoam eyes. He dreamt of an ocean that whispered names he had forgotten, and some he had never known. One afternoon, while cleaning the storage shed, Eliot found a wooden box with his name carved into it. Inside, beneath layers of cloth, was a brass compassit's needle unmoving. Beneath it, a small paper tag. "When you no longer need direction, may you always remember where you started." He held it in his palm, feeling the warmth of its metal despite the cool breeze. He tucked it into the pocket of his coat and walked up the hill where he could see the lighthouse, his home, from a distance. The wind carried the scent of salt and sun-warmed stone. The lighthouse continued to hum with life. Children's laughter echoed briefly in the garden one morning. Visitors with a picnic who left behind a sketch of a sea serpent and a thank you note in crayon. A violinist played on the cliffs during twilight. Eliot sat quietly inside and let the music wash through him. He no longer marked days by a calendar, but by the stories they brought. A poem left beneath a teacup, a shell shaped like a heart. A story shared at twilight, about a grandfather who used to whistle to the stars. Each moment layered like sediments, slow, soft, enduring. One morning he found a stone figurine on the doorstep, a miniature lighthouse carved with incredible precision. Its base was inscribed with a simple phrase, "For the keeper who never stopped keeping." He placed it beside the lantern at the top of the tower. Eliot began to notice the birds again. Not just the gulls, but the swallows and herons, the tiny wren nesting near the shed, and a lone white egret that always stood silently by the tide pools. He began to sketch them, paint them, name them. He found joy in the smallest rustle of feathers, when the wind returned in early June high, keening. Filled with salt, Eliot stood outside, arms open. He breathed it in deeply, eyes closed. He let the air carry away the last pieces of sorrow that clung like fog. He had come to the lighthouse to escape noise. Now he cherished the gentle symphony it offered, the cry of gulls, the ticking of the Blanton gear, the whisper of the waves, the soft shuffle of feet on the stairs, the scratch of his pen, and always, somewhere in it all, the echo of something greater, something left behind, something still reaching. He was ready, whatever came next. Eliot knew the lighthouse had done more than guide ships. It had guided him. It had become a vessel for healing, a sanctuary for passing spirits and living souls alike. And in its quiet constancy, Elliot had found not only solace, but purpose. The days turned longer as summer folded over the cliffs, laying its golden hush across the grasslands and the pebbled shore. The lighthouse stood eternal as it always had, its beacon slicing gently through dusk, like a whisper meant only for those still wandering. Elliot awoke one morning to a sunrise painted so vividly across the sky it seemed the sea itself had caught fire. It stained the windows rose and golden, and the light pooled across the wooden floor like spilled honey. He made tea, set the table for one, then for two out of habit, and took his place in the garden beside the sunflowers, now taller than his shoulders. It was quiet, but not empty. The lighthouse always held a fullness, as if the memories it had absorbed through decades were now blooming like sea heather. A letter arrived with the tide that day, not in a bottle, not tucked into a stranger's coat, but in a dry patch of sand, between two flat stones, wrapped in oilskin, tied with a seaweed cord. The envelope bore no name, no address, only a simple anchor sketched in graphite. Inside was a single page. The sea remembers all who listen, and it waits for your reply. There was no signature, and yet Elliot knew who it was from. The feeling wasn't sudden. It had been building for weeks, no years. The sea had always been trying to speak, and now it was calling. He turned the page over. A second line had appeared, ink still drying. The time is near. Follow the light you've kept for others. The sky grew stiller in the days that followed, not the dead calm of fear or silence, but a thoughtful stillness, as if the world was waiting, not holding its breath, but holding its arms open. It began with the tides. One evening, Elliot noticed the waves had begun to glow, not brightly, just a shimmer bioluminescent and bluish crest-catching stars that hadn't yet arrived in the sky. They lapped gently at the rocks and carried with them the scent of wild oranges and something older, something like memory made manifest. Elliot packed a small satchel. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew it would be somewhere beyond the shore. He took nothing but his compass, the green leather journal, and the photograph June had taken. Before locking the lighthouse door behind him, he turned back and found it already open. Inside stood a woman, barefoot, her coat lined with sea salt, hair threaded with silver and gull-feather white. She looked like someone who had walked miles through time. Marin, Elliot breathed. She smiled softly, not sad, not triumphant, just real. You kept it burning. I always hoped... No, she interrupted gently. You knew. They walked together, not speaking, down the path that led past the tide pools and the driftwood altar. The sea stretched wider than he'd ever seen, its horizon now flickering with distant lights. Not ships, not stars, lighthouses, dozens, maybe hundreds, each one blinking in time with the others, like a heartbeat shared across the ocean. Elliot stood in awe. These are the places where people waited, Marin said. Every light is someone who chose stillness, someone who chose to listen, to keep a flame for the weary. They reached a cove, Elliot had never noticed before. Rocks parted like curtains, and inside was a boat, small but sturdy, painted the color of the lighthouse door. Elliot stepped in. Merrin didn't follow. "You're not coming." She shook her head. "My light's elsewhere now. I was only here to remind you to go." He tried to speak, but no words would come. She touched his hand. "There's more than one way to guide. You've done yours well. But now, it's your turn to be carried." The boat moved of its own accord, slipping through the water as the cove opened to a shimmering pathway of light. The sea lit up with stories. Shapes danced beneath the waves, memories, dreams, long-forgotten songs. The stars overhead pulsed, in rhythm with his heart. The lighthouse faded behind him, not vanishing, but growing smaller part of a greater constellation of beacons. Asterisk as the boat glided into open water. Elliot felt something shift inside him, not of fear or uncertainty, but a loosening like the unraveling of a knot that had quietly existed for years. The further he drifted from the shore, the more the world seemed to transform. The stars above swam lazily across the sky, rearranging themselves into constellations he'd never seen. Not bears or archers or dragons, but maps of memories. Places he'd only dreamt of. Faces he hadn't remembered in decades. The sea opened wide, a silver mirror stretching farther than reason. Crapes flitted beneath the surface whales, the size of houses, rays with wings like tapestries, serpents ancient and gentle. Elliot reached down, and the water shimmered at his touch. Each ripple carried sans a laugh he knew was his mother's, the echo of his father's voice calling across a field, the soft lull of June reading aloud on rainy days. Dot, and then came the voices, not loud or commanding, but woven into the breeze. They told no single story, but countless fragments. A girl watching her grandmother knit beside a cold stove. A sailor seeing his homeland for the last time. A boy who buried a note in the sand and whispered a promise to the wind. All these memories danced like lanterns in the mist around Elliot's boat. A fog rolled in, cool but not frightening. It clung with familiarity. The boat slowed. Elliot stood, unsure of whether he was drifting forward or being welcomed back. And then the mist parted. Before him rose a tower, not tall like the lighthouse he had kept, but built of soft glowing stones stacked by unseen hands. Windows blinked like eyes, and from its apex a strange beam of light arched skyward, not yellow or white, but the color of possibility. Elliot felt himself drawn to it. The boat nudged a landing, and he stepped out onto a shore made of ground, seashells, and memory. Every step felt like walking into a deeper version of himself. Inside the tower, the air was warm. Every wall was lined with books. Each book bore no title, only a name. He ran his hand along the spines. June, Marin, Tomas, Yuki, Benjamin, even his own. When he touched his name, the book opened pages, flipped slowly, revealing his life in textures, by and scents, and images, not written in ink, but lived through sensation. He saw the day he first saw the lighthouse, felt the salt sting of that first winter storm, remembered the sound of Marin's laugh as clearly as a bell. And then the book wrote something new. The keeper has crossed. A new light begins. A soft tone chimed above. Elliot looked up. A skylight opened, and through it he saw the sea again, but from above, as though he had risen into the sky. Thousands of lighthouses blinked back at him, each tethered to a story, each one a heart still beating. Then came the twist dot, the vision shimmered dot. Elliot was no longer in the tower. He stood in a small room. It smelled of paper and old cedar. A window faced a quiet cove. At the desk sat a young man, perhaps no older than Elliot had been when he first came to the lighthouse. The young man looked tired, lost, but determined. Before him sat an empty notebook, the kind with green leather binding. Elliot felt something stir. He tried to speak, couldn't, because now he wasn't Elliot. He was the lighthouse. He watched as the young man opened the book and began to write. The first line, "There's a place by the sea, and it has a light that never goes out, dot, 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 outside." A storm stirred in the distance. The waves grew restless. The beacon from Elliot No, the lighthouse turned, casting its glow through mist and dark. The young man kept writing. Elliot, now the essence within the light, felt his presence gently anchor in that tower by the sea. His thoughts moved not in words, but in rhythm, in patience, in warmth. The boy at the desk, he was the next keeper, and far across the water another soul stirred from slumber. Somewhere, someone else heard the call. A lighthouse blinked in the distance, and a soft voice whispered, "Come home." The sea listened, and for a moment everything was still. Then, as the new keeper rose to tend the light, the final chapter began again, not as an ending, but as a beginning, wrapped in quiet and carried on the tide.